Hassani. I'm here today to present on SharePoint 2013 hybrid deployments. Sessions entitled the end-to-end configuration process. The end-to-end configuration process would involve covering a lot and spending more than 1 hour talking about this sort of stuff. So hopefully in this session I can kind of highlight some of the key areas throughout that end-to-end configuration process. As I say, my name's Sam. I'm from the UK. I'm currently working as a consultant at Brightstar, a Microsoft partner. Prior to joining Brightstar about a year ago, I worked at Microsoft as a Premier Field Engineer for about 7 to 8 years. And during my time at Microsoft, I was fortunate enough to attend and obtain the Master Certification for SharePoint 2010. And one of my final stints at Microsoft before I left was working as a beta support engineer for about 12 months prior to the launch of SharePoint 2013. And during that time, I was involved with a lot of upgrades from SharePoint 2010 to 2013, architecting a lot of new 2013 environments, but also looking at the hybrid scenario and working through kind of the new Office 365. So Office 365 built on SharePoint 2013. And how that kind of fits into the hybrid world. So as I say, in today's session, we'll take a look at the situation as it is today for hybrid deployments. And when we talk about hybrid deployments, we're talking about a hybrid deployment between SharePoint 2013 on-premises and SharePoint Online in Office 365. We'll start by thinking about the kind of business case for hybrid, when it makes sense to actually consider a hybrid deployment. Given that you guys have attended this session, I'm sure that you already have some sort of desire or motives to want to set up an environment in that scenario, so it'd be good to kind of hear your thoughts around that. We'll then cover some of the kind of key steps in the configuration process once we've talked about some of the supported scenarios around that. And then we'll wrap up by thinking about some of the kind of final considerations you need to make should you go down this route, and some of the challenges that I face, and I know others in the community have also faced when looking at configuring and building out hybrid deployments. So to start with, why hybrid? So how many of you today are working in organizations or with organizations that are running SharePoint in Office 365? Many of you? Okay, quite a few. And how many of you are actually running SharePoint on-premises and Office 365? Okay, a few of you. And of those guys, are you guys running SharePoint in hybrids at the moment? Or are you looking at doing that? Okay, cool. That's good to know. So a few of you there have obviously explored this a little bit already. But I'm sure you'll all agree the case for moving to SharePoint Online is attractive. I mean, we're all aware of some of the kind of key benefits and reasons to consider SharePoint Online. The whole cloud model allows us to kind of not necessarily spend time and investment in internal infrastructure, looking after masses of servers, SharePoint content databases, maintaining all of that can often be a headache. So SharePoint Online allows us to kind of just focus on actually getting the most out of SharePoint rather than spending time investment in the infrastructure. Obviously, SharePoint Online too allows us to benefit from the latest and greatest. So as Victor mentioned this morning, 97% of tenants are running on version 16. So if you're in SharePoint Online, you're going to receive the most regular updates, the most up-to-date functionality that Microsoft are actually providing through SharePoint. Saying that, there are some kind of caveats to be aware of. You've probably heard of some of the horror stories where running on the latest bits isn't necessarily always the best thing, and things can break. I've experienced that firsthand, both in SharePoint and in Yammer. You probably have too. But generally speaking, SharePoint Online does have its benefits, and most importantly, it's the direction Microsoft is going with SharePoint. We know that we have at least one more version of SharePoint on premises, but SharePoint Online is, clearly the future of SharePoint, and it's Microsoft's kind of direction of their roadmap. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is ready for SharePoint Online today. We all have a lot of investment in SharePoint on premises. you've invested in infrastructure, you've invested time into the way the service is managed internally. SharePoint Online obviously isn't some magic bullet right now. There are limitations. Functionality-wise, it doesn't offer everything that you can do and consume in terms of service capability as SharePoint on premises. A big area there is around customizations. We obviously have the cloud app model, and there are some sessions today that will talk about that and the benefits of development in SharePoint Online. But it doesn't offer a like-for-like replacement as to how our customizations deployed as full farm trust solutions do run today. And there's the issue around data, protecting data. I know in the UK with some of the public sector customers that I've worked with, moving that data to the cloud isn't something that they can do tomorrow. It's something that they have to plan for. They have to ensure that from a regulatory perspective and compliance to maintain that, certain things will need to change, and certain data will always need to be protected and maintained on site in their own data centers. And that's something that may never change for some organizations. But what a hybrid deployment allows us to achieve is really the best of both worlds. So this is kind of a generic definition for any hybridization, but really we can take the strengths and weaknesses and understand where they are, and then build our solution around that to ensure that we're kind of maximizing our investment as we do migrate into the cloud. So some common kind of hybrid scenarios around that, and where a hybrid scenario does make sense. So firstly, rapid provisioning of new workloads. You may be running SharePoint on premises today. You may see some new great functionality that SharePoint Online offers, maybe some of the BI capabilities in SharePoint Online take your fancy. It might be the case that you look at SharePoint Online to provision BI workloads, but maintain your collaborative workloads on premises. You may have already decided that you do want to move to SharePoint Online in its entirety, but you're not ready to just switch off everything you have on premises today and start working in SharePoint Online tomorrow. With a hybrid deployment, you can actually consider migrating key workloads in a phased fashion. So take some of your SharePoint sites today, take others in a few months' time. Alternatively, you may be ready to move everything to the cloud and have everything running in SharePoint Online, but there's always going to be certain things that you need to run on premises. So you may use your on-premises environment to supplement your cloud environment. Certain customizations that you're not going to be able to rewrite and deploy in SharePoint Online, you can maintain those solutions in your SharePoint on-premises environment. And there's obviously the data hosting location, which we kind of just touched on. So from a SharePoint perspective specifically, in terms of what you can actually do and what configuration and capability there is out of the box, this is what we have for support. So the key three scenarios here are Search, BCS, and Duet Enterprise Online. Just a quick one. Anyone here using Duet Enterprise? No? Okay, that's usually the response I get, because I've never really used it or worked with it myself, but it seems to be one of the key scenarios that's covered in all the Microsoft documentation. Yeah, I'm still trying to find that customer that's using it, so came all the way to Stockholm and still can't find it. Anyway, the two that are probably of more interest to you guys, I imagine, would be Search and BCS. So what hybrid search gives us in SharePoint Online and SharePoint on premises is the ability from a single location to actually retrieve content, so in a search center, say, from our local SharePoint environment on premises and our SharePoint Online sites, and bring those results back in one place. If you think about the scenario where you have SharePoint sites on premises and SharePoint sites online, your users may be a little confused as to where certain content is stored. And they don't really care where that content is as long as they can access it. So providing them a single entry point as to where those users can retrieve the content they need is a really, really useful scenario. And that's really going to be kind of the focus of this session when we go through some of the demos. BCS, again, this is a slightly more specific scenario in the hybrid world, but what we can do with BCS is actually have SharePoint Online sites through the use of an app or an external list actually connect to an OData service on premises, presuming you have the right configuration and topology set up, and render that information in SharePoint Online from line of business applications that you might have on premises. And it's a similar setup for Duet Enterprise Online. I believe that Duet Enterprise Online will actually use the BCS capabilities to do the same kind of thing there within SharePoint Online sites or Duet Enterprise Online sites. So to kind of drill down into the search scenario a bit more deeply, the way that this actually works is it's not crawling your SharePoint Online sites, as you probably are aware, but what we're doing here is we're establishing a connection to a remote index. So you may be familiar with the search federation capabilities we had in SharePoint 2010. We now have what we call result sources in SharePoint 2013 and SharePoint Online. Result sources, generally speaking, take the federation capabilities that we had in 2010 and the search scope capabilities and kind of combine these. And with the use of, again, another new concept introduced in SharePoint 2013, query rules, what we can do is when we issue a search query from our search center, as we have done in this case here, we can take that same query and fire it over to our remote index that's configured as a result source and bring back results from both SharePoint Online and SharePoint sites hosted locally on premises. And what you can see here is the results are actually returned as blocks. So we have our results from the cloud and the results from the on-premises environment displayed here. One thing which a lot of customers ask for is actually the ability to interleave your results that have come from SharePoint Online and SharePoint on-premises. That's not something that's possible. What you'll see though when we do configure this is that you have the ability to specify where that results block actually appears within your search results. So where your SharePoint Online results in this case appears. Do you want it to always appear at the top, or do you want it to be interleaved as a block within your local results? So SharePoint, I don't know what logic it uses, but based on its relevancy and ranking model, it will place that block within the results in terms of how that ranking compares to your local results. So we can see how that works a little more closely shortly. But before you kind of consider and before you go into the detail around configuring the SharePoint specifics, there's a lot of groundwork that you need to do. This is kind of the boring stuff, but it's really crucial and essential to get this right and establish this before you move on and configure the SharePoint specific pieces. And the first one really is around the identity management. So how you manage this, and the entire single sign-on process for your end users is really kind of crucial here, if that's something that you're looking to provide to them. So the last thing users want when you are providing a solution whereby certain content is in online and certain content is on premises is forcing them to have to repeatedly type in their credentials, signing in, signing out. Managing multiple sets of credentials can be a real nightmare for those users. So you need to kind of think about the strategy that you'll take there. Once you've done that, I like to move on to the next piece, which is really around the infrastructure of your SharePoint environment on premises and how that can speak to your SharePoint Online tenant. It really doesn't matter which way and which order you kind of carry these tasks out. That's kind of the general Microsoft approach to take, but you can do these things in whatever suits you really. When it comes to identity management though, there's really three flavors of identity management in terms of the approach you can take that can be considered. So the first, the most straightforward, is where you have cloud identities which don't really have any kind of relation to the identities that you use on premises. So when you sign up for a new SharePoint Online tenant, you specify the domain, which will kind of be .onmicrosoft.com. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that. You've seen that before. Yeah. And you can leave things as that, and you can use the sign-in assistant tool that Office 365 provide to kind of automatically sign into Office 365 applications like Lync and Exchange and so on, and it works okay. But really when it comes to SharePoint, you probably want to take that next step and provide some kind of closer integration between the identities that are used online and on premises. And this is where directory synchronization comes in. Directory synchronization relies on a tool called dsync, which I'm guessing a lot of you have probably heard of. Are you familiar with that? So what DirSync allows you to do is to take your directory that you have on premises, Active Directory in this case, and replicate all of it or a subset of it to your Office 365 tenant. So Azure Active Directory that's associated with your tenant in this case. And with the updates that were released kind of midway through last year, as well as taking those accounts, you can actually take the accounts with the passwords too. So if password changes occur on premises, those passwords are maintained in sync online too. So that kind of offers a level of single sign-on at a relatively low cost. You obviously require a server to run DirSync and to kind of perform the synchronizations between your on-premise environment and the cloud. But a lot of kind of thought around this is that if you're going to go to the effort to build your DirSync server and establish the connection with Office 365, you may as well take that next step and provide true single sign-on using an identity provider such as ADFS to be able to federate your identities. So you actually, in this case, have a single identity which is federated, and these are your on-premises identities. So when you actually work with Office 365, you're not maintaining two separate accounts. It's your one account that you have, and you're authenticated using ADFS or an equivalent product like Ping, Federate is another kind of popular choice around that. Obviously, going with the federated approach does require additional hardware, additional configuration, but really that's required for the true single sign-on, and that's something we'll take a look at in just a moment. So there's a lot that needs to be configured around directory synchronization. As I mentioned, you need a server that's dedicated to run DirSync. That's one of the prereqs there. Once you have that server established, you can activate directory synchronization in Office 365. I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. You can then install and configure the directory sync tools. This is what we refer to as DirSync. And really what DirSync is kind of a specialized kind of hashed up version of FIM, just as we have for SharePoint with profile synchronization, its own version of FIM. This is what DirSync is. And using the DirSync tool in this case is limited to 50,000 objects to be synchronized from your Active Directory on premises to the cloud. If you have more than 50,000 objects, you're probably going to be working quite closely with Microsoft anyway, but they'll work with you to provide capability using the FIM connector for Office 365, which gives you a lot more flexibility if you have multiple forests and so on. That's something that you would need to consider too. But the tool isn't really readily available to the public as of yet. It requires some kind of specific configuration, and the documentation around it isn't quite up to scratch yet for public consumption. Okay. So once you have kind of DirSync in place, which is the prereq for setting up single sign-on with ADFS or equivalent, to take the steps to configure SSO, there's a few things you need to do. So you need to prepare your Active Directory. There's a few prereqs around the Windows Server functional level, Server 2003, R2. You need to make sure your UPNs are correctly set. So what I mean by this is internally your domain may be referred to as contoso.local. When you register that externally and establish trust with Office 365 for that domain, you probably wouldn't use that. You would use something like contoso.com. So then when your users actually sign into Office 365, they would sign in as andy@contoso.com. That contoso.com is the UPN suffix, which would then need to be added to your AD site internally, so that when you perform the authentication, that domain name is recognized. Obviously, you need to deploy ADFS or an equivalent product. You can use an existing ADFS setup if you have, or if you're using any other single sign-on provider internally for other applications, you can consider using those. ADFS isn't the only supported option. There are multiple options that you can consider there. You then have the Windows Azure Active Directory module for PowerShell, and this kind of previously was referred to as the Microsoft Online tools, and this is how you actually kind of set up the domain, the federation, and ensure that directory sync is activated and running, you use these tools here and the PowerShell commands to do so. The final piece really is setting up that trust between ADFS and your Windows Azure AD to handle the authentication. There's some great documentation on TechNet which actually walks you through that in a very, very structured way. I won't bore you with the details too much on that now, but really that's kind of the key step of establishing the trust relationship. Okay, so I'll show you what this looks like. I have a demo environment where I have set up my trust relationship between my on-premises farm and SharePoint Online. And I'm actually running my demo environment in Windows Azure VMs. So not only are we going to be able to demonstrate the fact that the hybrid scenario can be configured and is configurable in the way that we've kind of discussed, but also proving that the on-premises environment in this scenario could actually be hosted in Windows Azure. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics on that shortly when we come to look at the different SharePoint topologies that you can consider. However, for the purposes of the demo, you can see that I have a server here running as my domain controller, also running SharePoint and SQL, obviously not following Microsoft best practice, but reducing the costs of my very expensive Windows Azure VMs. I have another server running ADFS, and then I have a third server that's running DirSync and the Azure AD PowerShell modules. My domain is hassanionnprem.com. I then have an Office 365 tenant where I have a few site collections set up. This is my Brightstar, my company's development environment, and you can see brightstardevelopment.onmicrosoft.com is the tenant name there. So what we'll do is flip over to that, and I'll show you some of the kind of core configuration that we have in place. So over here on Hassani on-prem, so this was the SharePoint DC all-in-one server running on my on-premises domain. And I'm accessing the tenant here, but before I kind of show you a few things there, let me just show you a few pieces here using the Windows Azure Active Directory module. So the first thing I can do here is actually connect to my tenant, and using this command, let's connect msol service. You can see that there. And it then gives me the option to sign in, and I use my credentials to do that. And the way that it signs in is by associating the username that I have with my tenant. So that's kind of how it connects to the correct tenant. It's based on the username that I'm typing in here and connecting with. So that should come back through okay. The first thing I can show you is my company information. So again, msol company information. I'll zoom in here. And so this gives me some generic information. You can see my address there if you want to post me anything. It's my actual address and my phone number. But really what's interesting here is around the directory synchronization properties. So you can see that I have got directory synchronization enabled. So DirSync is configured, it's activated, it's all up and running. You can see the last sync time, which I believe was this morning. And the DirSync, I didn't mention earlier, by default will sync every 3 hours. If you need to actually force a synchronization, you can do that. So there is a PowerShell script which is pre-configured as part of the DirSync installation, which allows you to you can run that script and force the synchronization to happen as required. And you can see that password synchronization is enabled too. The other things that I want to show you here are the domains that I have federated. So if I do get msol domain, let's come out of that bit. So what we can see here is one of these domains. So we've got the kind of standard tenant name there. But the key one here is hassanionnprem.com, and that's my on-premises domain. So now my tenant's telling me that we are federated for authentication with this domain, and that's because I've gone through the process of configuring ADFS and establishing the trust relationship between my domain here and SharePoint Online, or Office 365 more specifically. And then just quickly to show you some of the users, because we'll be referring to these just now, I've done a get MSL user, and you can see we've got a few different users here that have actually been imported to my Azure Active Directory. You can see a few of them have HassaniOnprem.com, which are my local users from my on-premise environment that have been synced with Azure AD. You can also see that I've got at Brightstar Development, which is the cloud identity user. So that user hasn't been synced. My Sam Hassani account from Hassani On-Prem. This is a pure cloud identity. And then you can see this is licensed or not. So it's purely down to the fact that my Office 365 tenant, I have 3 user licenses, and I've only associated with those with 3 of the users. So the other users haven't actually been activated and haven't been assigned an Office 365 license, so won't be able to log in or do anything with SharePoint Online in this case. So John Doe is the user we'll be logging in with. And what we'll do is we'll log on to another machine. So this is another machine within my domain. It's actually used for DIRSync, for directory synchronization. You can see it's called Sam Hassani MSOL, but I'm really just going to use it now to demonstrate how logging in with a particular user, how we can see the single sign-on process, because I don't actually have any other machines available to use in this environment. But what I'll do is sign in here, open a browser. So here we've got a SharePoint site hosted, HassaniOnprem.com. This is in my on-premises SharePoint environment. I'm logged in there as you'd expect through a domain machine. That all works fine. You have single sign-on inherently, obviously, in that scenario. If, however, I choose to visit a SharePoint Online team site, so let's hit that. So the URL for that, as you probably saw there, was brightstardevelopment.sharepoint.com. I'm not signed in. And obviously the single sign-on process, if I do say choose to keep me signed in here, that will allow me to sign on without having to go through this process every time. Because it's the first time I'm doing this, I want to show you what it looks like. So now if I log in with John Doe, as soon as I start typing at HassaniOnprem.com and I hit tab, you can see that it's redirecting me to a sign-in page. And what's happening there, if you don't know how quickly that happens, but what you could see is it actually redirected me to ADFS on premises, which handled the authentication for me and has signed me in now to SharePoint Online. Something's gone not quite right there, where the site won't actually load. Let's try that again. Okay, so you can see we're now logged in. Obviously something funny went wrong there. But I didn't have to type in my credentials. That single sign-on process has happened seamlessly for me as an end user via ADFS, and I'm fully authenticated. I can check the Keep Me Signed In button, and I wouldn't have to actually ever go through the process of even typing my username in. So there we have single sign-on with DIRSync. Just flip back to the slides and talk about some of the SharePoint pieces now. So if you think about the kind of slide we showed a few minutes ago where we had the kind of key steps of building up the hybrid deployment, we had identity management, the infrastructure around that. We then had the configuring the SharePoint environment piece. And this really is that. So this is thinking about the topology that you need to consider and how this actually affects some of the trust relationships that you need to establish between your on-premises environment and SharePoint Online. So the first topology, which is kind of worth discussing, is what is known as the outbound topology, and this is in line with all Microsoft documentation, so this is kind of the correct terminology to use when you are investigating or researching these topics. But what the outbound topology is where we have a SharePoint on-premises environment and a SharePoint Online environment, and the online environment trusts our on-premises environment. So what that means is when we perform searches, say, from a search center in our on-premises environment, we can actually retrieve results outbound. So we can bring in results from our SharePoint Online sites and render those in our SharePoint sites on premises. However, the inbound route isn't set up or configured. So there's no trust relationship in the opposite direction. And what that means is the SharePoint Online sites can issue search queries and return content from the local sites in SharePoint Online, but can't actually retrieve results from our SharePoint on-premises environment. So this, although it sounds quite limiting, it is actually quite a common deployment from what I have seen. The opposite topology, if you like, is what we refer to as the inbound. So this is where the SharePoint on-premises environment is trusted by SharePoint Online. And here, we can only search two-way or bring back results from SharePoint Online and SharePoint on-premises from within our SharePoint Online sites. So if we perform search queries on-premises, we'll only see local results. The difference here really is the addition of the reverse proxy device to the perimeter network in our on-premises environment. And this is a requirement if you want to be able to actually bring the results through or set up BCS, as you'll see in a moment, for SharePoint Online, for that trust relationship to be established in this direction. The reverse proxy device is an interesting one. So you may or may not be aware, Microsoft have announced that they're retiring the Forefront suite of products. So obviously that leaves us in a kind of bit of a sticky situation from a SharePoint perspective, where we're used to using TMG or UAG for publishing SharePoint externally. At the moment, we're kind of still waiting on guidance for this particular scenario. Obviously, Windows Server 2012 R2 has the WAP capability. WAP, is that the right acronym? Yeah. So that is an option in terms of publishing SharePoint externally. Whether or not that's a supported option for this particular hybrid scenario, I think it is. There has been a few blog posts indicating that it is by Steve Peshka. I'd expect that we get some official guidance from Microsoft and TechNet updated very, very shortly. But there's also other third-party reverse proxy devices that would be supported for this scenario too. So there was a white paper that was released, and again, Steve Peshka and Ali Mazahiri have blogged about this white paper, which describes how you would configure the F5 Big IP device for this particular scenario. I'm not aware of any other supported devices at the moment, but keep tuned for that. So the two-way bidirectional topology is really establishing the trust relationship in both directions, and this really is kind of the most rich experience if you want to be able to have search results from both online and on-premises in search centers in both locations. And it's also the requirement if you want to have the BCS hybrid scenario configured and set up and working, and the Duet Enterprise scenario too. So in terms of the configuration steps around that, obviously you need to publish SharePoint externally through the reverse proxy device that you choose so that it is externally accessible. But the key stage really is around establishing the trust relationship between your SharePoint farm and the SharePoint Online tenant, and that really involves establishing the server-to-server authentication trust relationship. And there's a whole load of steps that you need to follow around exchanging certificates, creating a certificate in the first place, exchange certificates to establish that trust relationship. Again, this is pretty well documented on TechNet, so the exact commandlets are listed out for that and the steps that you need to follow for that. But ensure that you are following the correct steps based on the topology that you are setting up there to ensure that the trust relationship is established correctly. Once you have that trust relationship established, you can dive into SharePoint and actually configure the specific scenario that you're interested in. So for search, that would involve configuring your result source, and that's the federation piece around configuring the remote index URL. If you're going with the inbound topology, you would actually need to use secure store to store the client certificate, and that certificate is what would be stored within the reverse proxy device too. But it's what you need to install within the secure store, so there's some additional steps there to actually be able to have your results from your on-premises environment retrieved and returned in your SharePoint Online sites. And then finally, you would configure the query rule to show your remote results, and that query rule would be responsible for when you specify that you're issuing a query in a search center, the rule will ensure that the same query is issued to your remote index. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. So if we flip over here, what I'll first show you is the fact that we've got some real content in these two environments. So in my intranet, so as you can see here, we're in HassaniOnprem.com intranet. It's my on-premise SharePoint site. If I go to my document library, you can see I've got a few just basic documents in here. These are text files really. It's got the word test written inside for the purpose of the demo. If I flip over to my SharePoint Online site, so again, notice the URL there, brightstardevelopment.sharepoint.com. This is Office 365 clearly. You can see that we've got these SP Online documents, or text files, which have got the word test written inside them. So what I've configured is an outbound topology. So what that means is from my on-premise search center, I should be able to retrieve items that are stored locally and items that are stored in my SharePoint Online sites. So I perform a search query for test. Within everything, you can see that I just at the moment have results being returned from my on-premise SharePoint site. And that's because I've not configured the result source or the query rule yet. So I'll go ahead and do that. And so if we go into site settings for the search center, and I go down to result sources, you can see defined for the site collection, I have one here, SharePoint Online test. That's really the backup in case the demo doesn't work out quite right. But hopefully we won't need to use that today. First thing to do is add this result source. So I'm going to call it SPS Online Result Source Demo. And the key piece here is selecting the remote SharePoint option. Whoa. Did I just close that? No. Select remote SharePoint down here. And as soon as I selected that, you'll see we have a new field to enter the remote service URL. And really all we need to enter here is the root site collection of the remote SharePoint farm. So in this case, I'm just going to enter a site collection that exists in my SharePoint Online tenant. And what I can do is just flip over here, copy that out. So my brightstardevelopment.sharepoint.com site, paste it into here. Make sure that's in correctly. Don't need to worry about anything else. I don't need to specify the SSO ID because remember I'm getting outbound. If I was configuring inbound, there'd be some kind of slightly different and additional steps that we need to perform at this stage. So the result source is configured. You can see that it's active. The next thing to do is to configure the query rule. So if I go into search query rules, the first thing I need to specify is the context for which I want to configure this rule. So what we mean here is when do we actually want this query rule to be triggered and fired? So I want it to be triggered and fired every time I have results returned from my local SharePoint results. So on my search results page within my search center, this is the result set that's going to be returned from this result source. So I want this query rule to be triggered at that point in time when those results are returned to me. So if I hit new query rule, I'll give this a name, SPS demo query rule. We can specify here, so as you probably are aware, the query rules in SharePoint 2013 are very, very flexible and can be used for a number of different purposes. In this case, I don't want to specify a condition. I want the rule to be fired every time that I have results from this particular result source. So I'm going to remove that condition. What I'm going to do, though, is add a result block. So within this, what I want to specify is when the query rule is fired, I want to search an additional result source. And as you can see here, within the drop-down, I have the result source that I just created, SPS Online Result Source Demo. I can select the number of items, so by default it's 2. Let's just up that to 3. Within settings, you can see there's a few more options, so you can display a more link and then point that to a specific URL should you choose to. But the interesting one is this. So this block is always shown above core results, or this block is ranked within core results. This is what I kind of touched on earlier around whether or not our result block appears at the top of the search results page or interleaved somewhere. So when I kind of do these demos and tests, I always tend to select above the core results so that you know that it's there, because if you do select ranked within the core results, it might end up appearing kind of on your 5th, 6th, 7th page of search results. So depending on how SharePoint chooses to rank those results that are retrieved from SharePoint Online. Okay, so block is always above core results. I think that's everything we need there. We hit OK, and I save that. You can see now that that rule's been created, and it's kind of highlighted in blue rather than grey, which is grey was the one that I created earlier, and it says that earlier one is inactive. The one we just created now is active, supposedly. So if we go back to the search center and perform the same search query for test, you can see it took a little longer there, and what we now have is results for test. And you can see kind of these are highlighted within a block. Got the SharePoint Online results returned at the top of the page there, and then towards the bottom we have the SharePoint on-premises results. And obviously you could make this look a bit better. You don't have to have the results as a result block. You could even have a separate page that returns your SharePoint Online results. You could kind of customize this a little bit to make it a little clearer, so you have kind of 2 streams of results. Obviously we kind of have the standard SharePoint flexibility to do what we want with this page. But you hopefully get the general idea around that and some of the kind of configuration that needs to happen there. Any questions on that at all? Okay, one question here. So in terms of actually kind of trying to blend the results in a little more, no, so you can't interleave individual results. What you can do is the block that we have at the top of the screen here, there was that option which I showed, which says don't put the block at the top of the results page, just leave it, kind of the default option, and SharePoint would then use its ranking model, its default logic, to place that block where it thinks it should be ranked in relation to all the other results that it has. So based on kind of the analytical data that SharePoint uses to rank results, it would place that block where it seems most relevant and appropriate. But yeah, you'll always see it if you're using a results block. You'll always see it with this kind of block kind of like capability here, and it may be that it's just on a kind of further page down the set of results. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's kind of search. And obviously I mentioned earlier that BCS and Duet Enterprise Online is another kind of core hybrid scenario that you consider. But when people start kind of looking at this and thinking about it from a real practical perspective, there's a lot of other questions that come up. So social, obviously a big one when it comes to SharePoint and SharePoint Online. How do we handle this in the hybrid scenario? If you have SharePoint Online sites and SharePoint sites on premises, what about the social experience? What happens when I click newsfeed or edit my profile from a SharePoint Online site or a SharePoint on-premises site? Unfortunately, there is no great answer on this. So I don't have the answer. Yammer, exactly. So Yammer is one option. And that's kind of really the key message here, is that Microsoft isn't. Again, I'm not speaking on behalf of Microsoft. My personal view is that Microsoft clearly isn't going to invest into SharePoint Social anymore. Their investment and focus is Yammer. So the experience here isn't going to get better as we see it today. I can kind of show you a few little things that you can do and a few tricks maybe to make things a little better. And so I'll just quickly go back here. It's something that's already configured. So this is my intranet. Obviously, I'm logged in as John Doe here. If I click on Newsfeed, it takes me to my site host in on-premises. So if you look at the URL there, we've got my.hassanionprem.com. If I go to the SharePoint Online team site, again, I'm logged in as John Doe. You can see this is Office 365. The newsfeed icon, the URL is brightstardevelopment-my.sharepoint.com. If I click it, how I have this configured is, as you see there, it actually took me to the My site for John Doe on premises. Can anyone know what I've done here to get this working in this way? I'm sure a few people do. So what I've done is I've configured a trusted host location in SharePoint Online. So what I can show you is if we flip over to my admin center, just sign me out. So this kind of is a, I wouldn't recommend doing this because the experience isn't great, but it's just something that some people do try to kind of get around the issue, but it isn't really a good solution. So you can configure a trusted My Site host location. So when users click on that newsfeed button, it takes them to another My Site host that you specify. So in this case, I have SharePoint Online configured to take me to my SharePoint on-premises My Site host. However, what it doesn't do is it doesn't work, much to my amazement. Or if we go back to the team site online and you hit SkyDrive, where do you think it's going to take you now? There's not really any consistency. Oh, there is. Is that right? That didn't work earlier. Okay. Things change overnight in Office 365. It's the way it works. Equally, I mean, the kind of key point here, though, is yes, this may work for those two URLs, for those two links, but I'm sure many of you are aware of what the social architecture is in SharePoint 2013. So when I'm commenting, I add tags and notes, I write comments in SharePoint team sites on premises, all of that information, we know where that's stored. That's stored in content databases, social databases, My Site content databases on premises. That's never going to be replicated to on premises and vice versa. And nothing's going to change there. Microsoft's not going to make that better. So, you know, is Yammer the answer? Not really today, but maybe one day, and probably one day. That's kind of the direction to take. If you are using Yammer today, to be honest, it probably complicates things even more because suddenly you have kind of three social experiences that you need to think about. You've got your on-premise social sites, your profile, you've got your online profile, you've got your Yammer profile. Where does the user go? How do you kind of direct them? Obviously, governance can help, and you can, you know, educate them. But from a, you know, offering a solution to those users, what do you do? Who knows? So there's other challenges to think about as well in the hybrid scenario. You know, where am I? You have a search center which can present users with results, and users don't really care where they are. But if they are trying to navigate specific content, how do you actually kind of provide that seamless end-to-end transition from one site to another? It is useful for users to know whether or not they're in a particular site, and you can do things to kind of help with those transitions using branding and so on. You can build something to kind of provide maybe a global navigation across all of your online and on-premises sites. But then things are changing so quickly. It's difficult to advise you to kind of invest in building something which could, you know, be no longer relevant in the very near future. Something else that we've come up with is no test tenants in SharePoint Online, and this isn't strictly true, but when you are working with SharePoint Online or a hybrid deployment, it's kind of a jump in topic slightly, but really when you think about synchronizing particular users from your Active Directory on premises to SharePoint Online, you can only have one DirSync server per tenant. So if you want to actually have multiple tenants set up, say, for development purposes, particularly if you're working with multiple customers that are running with Office 365, how do you manage that? If you have multiple tenants, so a tenant, say, for each of those particular customers as you're kind of working on development processes and whatnot, you then need a DirSync server per tenant. There's a lot of overhead there in terms of managing that, and it's something that we've kind of come across as a bit of a challenge, and something that you have to consider as you're building through that. Obviously, the rapid incremental updates to SharePoint Online, we touched on this earlier. It's great that you receive, the best of SharePoint, the latest and greatest bits, but things do go wrong from time to time, and that can impact you. So just bear that in mind. Not only SharePoint Online, but Yammer too. And to be honest, I've seen it more in Yammer as of late than in SharePoint Online. To mention something, seeing 2-page loads, differing functionality. I think Thursday, all of the Yammer APIs seem to be up and down. I don't know if anyone else experienced that, but we were doing some big demos for a client, and suddenly a Yammer feed that we'd embedded in a SharePoint page just vanished. And we found out later on in the day that other customers that were kind of trying to do similar things had experienced the same issue. So things, we're going through a lot of change. Things are rapidly moving. But that's the kind of nature of the beast that we are working with at the moment. Another one is the IT operations piece. So today you're running SharePoint on premises. If you're working for a large organization, you've probably got your IT service desk in order. Your IT infrastructure team know how to deal with first line support issues that are raised, how those issues are escalated. If you're running in SharePoint Online entirely or in a hybrid deployment, things get even more confused and complex. How do you suddenly route users who have an issue with the SharePoint site to SharePoint Online support? Do they come through your own help desk? Do you then route that through? Do you have second line escalation to SharePoint Online support? Does SharePoint Online have the same SLAs that you offer to your organization from a support perspective? Does SharePoint Online support meet the bar in terms of what you expect from a support perspective, and can you offer that out directly to end users? A lot of kind of questions to consider there. So kind of to wrap up really, as you've seen, the hybrid story isn't the answer to every business requirement. It's not a magic bullet. It's not going to make all the pain go away immediately, but there is some out-of-the-box capability that does make sense and that will help you. Biggest piece of advice that I would offer though is to kind of understand what the capabilities of hybrid are, understand what the limitations are, and try and make it work for you if it makes sense. Don't try and bend it too much. Don't try and customize things too much. With SharePoint, if you do try and bend things too much, usually things end up breaking or snapping. So just bear that in mind. Some resources in the slide deck, should you need them. And that's it from me on this. Does anyone have any questions at all?
So how many deployments have you done with customers in the UK hybrid, finding it's increasing requirement, or at least people starting to have those initiating conversations about it, as they're trying to discover where they should be?
Yeah, definitely. In the UK, I've been working with one rather large customer on a hybrid deployment, and not so much hybrid, but more the whole identity management piece it seems to be a more common request. So for users that are moving to SharePoint Online, even if you're not using the hybrid capabilities of SharePoint, setting up the identity management infrastructure is a very, very common ask for those organizations that are going to use SharePoint Online or Office 365 in some shape or form. So yeah, I see a lot of people nodding their heads. I'm guessing that's kind of similar experiences for you guys as well.
How about licensing? Do you have any issues around that?
In what sense of licensing?
SharePoint Online, the enterprise agreements.
I haven't had too much exposure to that directly myself. Have you?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't really deal with licensing myself. I'll leave that to other people to worry about. Licensing is yeah, definitely not something I would try and get involved with. But yeah, obviously yeah, there's differences in licensing, and that needs to be considered. Obviously, the entire licensing model is very, very different for SharePoint Online compared to SharePoint on premises. So you need to obviously consider that for sure. It's a consideration to make. Any other questions at all? Thanks, Andy.
What about Kerberos and SharePoint Online hosting work online, calling services on premises to, so usually set SCM
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to set any SPNs to do that. So you wouldn't be able to configure, so the way you have reports rendered in SharePoint on-premise today speaking to cubes in back-end systems, I'm not really aware of a way that you'd be able to achieve that in SharePoint Online. Yeah, SharePoint Online obviously has its own BI capabilities. Yeah, exactly, which you should consider. Cross-site publishing in what respect? So what, content deployment or through search mechanisms? Yeah, remote index. So from a cross-site publishing perspective, if you have a content by search web part, you can specify the result source to use. So once you have that result source created with the remote index, you can use that result source in a number of different ways through SharePoint search. Obviously, I showed it in a kind of standard search results web part, but that result source, you can use it. So I have a customer that's tried to implement I won't get into the details of it. We didn't recommend the solution they designed on their own, but basically they have a global navigation across their SharePoint on-premises sites and SharePoint Online sites. It's all using search by pointing to the same result source. So yeah, you can kind of use the flexibility of search to achieve a lot. Okay, well, I'll wrap things up there. If you do have any questions, feel free to come up. I'll be around all day. So thank you very much for your time.